Hi, this is Professor Makimura. We're going to talk about the Cold War. I'm going to first talk about the broad picture, then I'm going to talk about what happened in Japan. I'm also going to try and cover what happened in China and in Southeast Asia and uh, Korea. If I have time, I would also like to talk about what happens in India, Middle East, and Africa, but we may not have time to fit everything in 2 lectures, so we shall see. Anyway, so first, let's do share screen and do the capitalist crisis, lecture number 15. So we got to the end of World War II last time, and now I want to talk about why the Cold War from 1945 onwards didn't become a hot war, and why, what the big idea is there. Okay, so with the defeat of the Axis powers, the alliance, which was made between the US, the USSR, and the UK, so United States, Britain, and Russia, uh, broke up. Uh, Basically, starting around 1947 or so, what we would call the Cold War started, and by 1949-50, it was full on. So the Cold War would last from then all the way until 1989. Some people would say it starts in 1945, right after the war, but that doesn't. But the details of 45, 47, 49, 50, 1950. It's not that big a deal. The point is, after World War II is over, relations break down pretty quickly, and the Cold War will last until 1989. Well, some people would say till 1991, but I think 89 makes more sense. Um, so what happened? Uh, who started the Cold War? Why did the alliance from World War II break down? Um, so if you got an education in the United States, the standard answer you're going to get from the textbooks or anywhere else, basically, is that the Cold War started because it's the fault of the Russians, specifically Stalin. So according to this story, what happened was the US and Russia had made an agreement, and Stalin had agreed to basically allow Eastern European countries to have free and fair elections after World War II. And once they decide, and they would be free to decide whether they want to be a capitalist country or a communist country. And of course, after World War II, that did not happen. And in all the areas that the Russian army was stationed, all these countries had almost all these countries became communist countries. Russia basically forced them to be communist. So this was a betrayal, and we said, that can't stand, and that was the crack that basically broke up the U.S. and the USSR. Stalin betrayed America. Simple as that. Okay, if you get an education in Russia, then you're going to get the flip side of the story. They will say that the U.S. Betrayed Russia, and for this, you have to go back to post World War I. So post World War I, Britain, France, America, and Japan sends troops to Russia. So Stalin does not trust America in the first place. Then World War II starts, and America says that America is an ally of Russia. But even though America says that it's an ally of Russia, it does not disclose that it is building a nuclear weapon. While, the secret that America is building a nuclear weapon is disclosed to Britain. So Churchill knows this, Roosevelt knows this, but Stalin is supposed to not know about this. So how can you trust these guys if if they're working on making this super weapon and they don't tell you about it? And why does Stalin know this? Well, I mean, Stalin knows this because he's got spies all over, America and Russia. Sorry, America and Britain. So that's why he knows. Um, So that makes Stalin think that, well, I mean, if these guys don't trust us to share the nuclear secret with us, then we can't trust them. So since the Germans invaded and killed 20 million Russians, we can't allow that to happen again. So to prevent that, we have to basically make Eastern Europe a buffer zone so that when the West invades Russia once again, they will have to go through the Eastern European countries first, and the home of communism, Russia, will basically be safe. And that's why it's America's fault. So where do I stand? Well, I think both sides of this story actually, both sides make sense, right? So it's like one of those things where it's like this horrible misunderstanding. If the U.S. had disclosed the nuclear secret to the Russians earlier, before it dropped the first bomb, if Stalin had allowed, free elections in Eastern Europe, and I suspect that if he actually did allow free and fair elections in Eastern Europe, a significant number of those countries probably would have chosen to be communist. Maybe not all of them, but a significant number. So he should have been happy with that, but he wasn't willing to take the risk. So it's like neither side is 100% responsible for this. This is one of those tragedies that happen. All right. So now, why is the Cold War? Why didn't it turn into a violent hot war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union? And the standard answer is usually MAD, M-A-D, mutually assured destruction. And that is that you had lots and lots of nuclear weapons on both sides. Once the Soviets actually got a hold of the nuclear weapons, then, by getting the secrets for the United States through their spies, excuse me, once the Soviet Union got the nuclear secrets, they started building nuclear weapons, although basically until the 1980s, the US always had a lead on the number of nuclear weapons compared to the Soviet Union. There was no missile gap at the time of John Kennedy. JFK said that the Russians had more missiles than America, and therefore the Democrats were going to pump more money into the military, et cetera. He called this the missile gap. There was none. The U.S. had more missiles than the Soviet Union. Anyway, back to the topic. So mutually assured destruction. If you have lots and lots of nuclear weapons, and if you go to war, and that will lead to global destruction, well, nobody's going to win. So you can't go to war. I think there's also another reason, or actually two more reasons. One is ideological, and this is ideological on both the American side and on the Russian side. And the other is, I think, economic. So let's do these both. So ideological. On the US side, there were two major ideas on how to deal with the communist threat. One idea was rollback, that we should actually do everything in our power to roll back the gains that the communists made and eventually smash communists. This was actually put into place during the Korean War. The US tried to go to North Korea and eliminate a communist country. But when I tried to do that and got to the Korean-Chinese border, Chinese communists crossed the border and overwhelmed U.S. forces, and U.S. forces had to go fight and get back Seoul. So this idea was abandoned and after the Korean War. And the other idea that became popular and was essentially followed pretty much throughout the Cold War was the idea of containment, that all you have to do is contain the communist powers. Now, the idea of containment eventually became so rigid that you couldn't spread communism to any country, period, and that's what led to the tragedy of the Vietnam War. But the original idea behind containment was actually pretty flexible. So the guy who comes up with the idea of containment is a fellow named George Kennan, and he writes this long telegram from Moscow, and it's called the long telegram. He signs it X, so it's also called the X telegram, but this is the basic idea. Okay, World War II has proven that there's basically 5 major centers of production in the world. One is, of course, the United States. Another one is, of course, Russia, or the Soviet Union. A third one is, of course, Britain. A fourth one is Germany. And a fifth one is Japan. So there are 5 countries. Now, at the end of World War II, the US has the United States, Britain, Japan, and half of Germany. So that's like 3.5, right, centers of production. The Soviets have, of course, the Soviet Union and half of Germany. So 1.5, right? My pinky finger is the 0.5. So what Kennan is arguing is that as long as we maintain this state that the US has 3.5 centers of production and the Soviets only have 1.5 centers of production, then the US doesn't have to worry. All it has to do is make sure that the Soviets don't get a center of global, industrial center of global production, and this way the US can feed its people, provide its people with all the consumer goods, and have a large military and be able to contain the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union is in a much weaker position, all you have to do is wait. Because if the Soviet Union tries to keep pace with the United States, then because they have a lower base of production, they will not be able to match us and they will lose. And in the long run, this is actually what happened, right? The United States and the Soviet Union go through this really long, drawn-out arms race between itself and building all these nuclear weapons. But because the US could effectively rely on 3.5 centers of production to produce military stuff and consumer products, the people in America were generally happy. Whereas in Russia, because they can only rely on 1.5, if they tried to match what the US was doing in terms of military might, well, they couldn't provide enough stuff for their people, and that's what really pissed off the Russian people, and eventually that's what caused the Russian system to collapse. All right, so that's one ideological reason from the US side. The ideological reason from the Soviet side basically lies in the nature of communism. According to communist theory, it is inevitable that capitalism, which is inherently unstable, and there I agree, that a capitalist system will break down and become communist or socialist, right? Socialist or communist. I don't think it's inevitable, but the Russians believed that this was inevitable. So there was no need for Russia to actually, spark the first, throw the first punch. All Russia had to do was wait. And as long as Russia doesn't get conquered militarily, if you just wait long enough, then capitalist systems will collapse, there would be rebellions within the capitalist systems, and communist countries would pop up, and Russia will win. So probably the closest period for that was the 1960s. The 1960s was the period when you had the Civil Rights Act in America and the Vietnam War, and it was causing a lot of internal turmoil in America, but it was also causing internal turmoil in other parts of Europe. And Japan too. So the 60s was a period when a lot of people in the Western world thought that capitalism is going to fail and there's going to be a slew of communist revolutions soon. Well, that didn't happen, obviously. So there you go. That was just a mistake. Yeah, sure. I mean, there were unrest, but there's no major systemic problem to destroy the whole thing. Okay. So economic. So lastly, economic. Unlike Germany and Japan, which were too small and didn't have all the natural resources necessary to maintain an industrial economy, chiefly oil, both the US and Russia had enough landmass to have an autarkic economic system, or a self-sufficient economic system. The Russians had all the materials they needed within the Russian, orbit. So the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, for a while, China, and other countries around the world that were communist basically were linked, and they could have all the raw materials needed, and they had all the markets that they had. Or it's not really markets because they don't have a capitalist system, but so there was no need for Russia to go attack like Japan. And same goes for America. America is a continental-sized country. It has huge amounts of natural resources, things like coal and oil, and it has a huge population that is very wealthy, so it can act as a market of last resort. So one of the problems of the capitalist system is if you don't pay your workers well, then the whole thing comes crashing down. Because the factories will overproduce, and they will not be able to sell all their stuff to their people. Well, in the case of the U.S., that wasn't going to happen because under FDR and Harry Truman, and then later under LBJ, the goal was to actually pay the workers a fair share. So they kept paying the workers well. And even if other countries did stupid things like that and didn't pay their workers that much, well, and they overproduced, well, then America could be the consumer of last resort. So, economically, there was no reason to go to war with each other. So the Cold War essentially becomes a competition between the US and the Soviet Union that uses peaceful means to compete. Um, One important example of this is the kitchen debate. The kitchen debate is when Nikita Khrushchev comes to America. He was the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, comes to America and meets Richard Nixon, who was the vice president at the time. The president of Nixon was the vice president, and Eisenhower was the president at the time. So when Khrushchev arrives, they discuss and they go to showrooms, and Tricky Dicky. I just said his name. I can't believe I'm blanking out. Oh, Richard Nixon, that's right. Richard Nixon shows Nikita Khrushchev around and says, "Hey, look at all the goods and look at all the goods and all the appliances that we have, so that our women who's at the home can have nice, easy lives." And Khrushchev basically turns that around and says, "Well, no, our women also have good lives too." And they have this debate and saying who can provide a better living standard for their people. Another competition is the space race. In the space race, the Soviet Union was ahead of America. The Soviets first launched Sputnik. This was the first satellite, and then they launched the first astronaut. The Soviets would call them cosmonauts. So this is Yuri Gagarin. And in response, JFK says the US will be the first to land a man on the moon. And we do. The US is the first to land a man on the moon. So that's the space race, right? So the arms race was pretty, scary. I remember I grew up in the 1980s and remember that, the biggest fear was, and the likely fear was possible global nuclear annihilation by mankind. It's really scary. Which actually, technically speaking, that threat's not really gone, because if the US and Russia does go to war with each other, a similar kind of destruction can happen, but we'll put that aside. At least the nuclear weapons are pointed at each other with, a hair trigger on both sides. So anyway, so that is the Cold War, right? That's the Cold War. That's the big picture of the Cold War. Now, in this big picture of the Cold War, many countries after World War II are going to become communist. So countries like Eastern Europe, so the countries in Eastern Europe that the Soviets had occupied, so Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany, all these places become communist. But beyond that, North Korea becomes communist. China becomes communist. Vietnam becomes communist. Laos and Cambodia becomes communist. There are communist insurgencies in India to this day, really. The many countries in the Middle East switch sides, the many countries in the Middle East basically rely on the Soviet Union for help instead of America for help. And many countries in Africa also become communist. So Ghana, for example, experimented with socialism for a while. Ethiopia becomes communist. The Congo tries to get help from the Russians, but the leader of Congo gets assassinated, essentially with CIA help. And Angola becomes communist too. So there are many countries that become communist. And if you stop for a moment and think about this, it kind of makes sense. There's a reason why you might want to become communist. In countries like in Southeast Asia, where you got screwed by capitalism, and all the wealth that the ordinary people produced was siphoned out of the country, and the people who benefited were the people who sucked up to the colonial masters, the middling group, either the overseas Chinese or the overseas Indians or educated locals. But the point is, the people who sucked up to the colonial masters were the ones who could accumulate wealth. Well, when these countries became independent, one question they asked was, hey, is it fair that all these countries, is it fair that all the people who, leached off the colonial imperial masters get to keep all that wealth, right? And you can kind of understand the sentiment. And if you say no, then you want to take their wealth away and redistribute that. And if you're going to do that, then you might as well have a communist revolution. Some countries, on the other hand, said, well, yeah, okay, this did happen. The elites did gather the wealth, but private property is private property. And if we adopt capitalism, maybe we can increase the total GDP of the country so that if it gets larger than the rate that the population increases, then the income of the ordinary people will inevitably go up, so we don't have to worry about this. And these countries became capitalist. So there you go. Makes sense. And there's also another reason why it became possible. So communist theory takes 3 steps. The first step takes place under Karl Marx, who talks about communism. He coins that term, after all. And according to Karl Marx, what was supposed to happen was a spontaneous revolution by ordinary people who got screwed by their factory bosses and said, we've had enough, and we want a different system. Lenin was the second guy, and he said, hey, well, hang on. If we know that it's inevitable that a capitalist country becomes a communist country, then we can actually nudge this process ahead. We can actually create a political party that leads the ordinary people to the desired goal. So that's Lenin. But in Lenin's idea, you have to have, industrial workers, because these are the people who have experienced being screwed by their bosses. The third phase happens under Mao Zedong, right? Mao basically says, well, hang on. If we know that this is the future path of history, then do you actually have to experience being screwed by a factory boss? And Mao's answer is, well, that doesn't make any sense. So the answer's got to be no, which means as long as you think like a communist, then you are a communist. And that allows communism to spread in places that were fundamentally rural in many parts of the world. Because, even if you're rural, if you have a communist party that educates the rural population and they say, hey, we don't like capitalism, and as long as we workers think, as long as we farmers think like communists, we're communists too, then, it's going to spread easier. So that's it. That's it with the story of communism. So now let me stop the share and now start the share on 20th century Japan, which is lecture note 16. And for here, the important point is that after World War II, Japan becomes a model for capitalist countries around the world, but primarily for capitalist countries near Japan, so capitalist countries in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So what is the Japanese model? Well, here's what happens. After World War II, Japan is occupied by the US from 1945 to 1952. Sovereignty technically lies with the Japanese government, but the United States Army, technically speaking, the United Nations force, but it's basically the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy, and then later the U.S. Air Force. But yeah, the U.S. military, basically, right? The U.S. military has final say on what happens in Japan. So the government isn't disbanded. The emperor's there, the parliament's there, But sitting on top of all that is Supreme Command Allied Powers, SCAP, right? The U.S. occupation. That's how this system works. And what happens is that in the first 2 years, there's this very idealistic reform movement to try to make Japan into a democratic and pacifist country. And then from 1947 till 1952, the next 5 years, they actually do what is called the reverse course, and they try to make Japan into a more conservative country that's going to be able to resist a possible communist invasion from either Russia or China or North Korea, which I don't think they were that serious about North Korea. But if North Korea, because North Korea first has to go through South Korea, and the U.S. had a military presence in South Korea. But it's possible that the Russian might come from the north, right? So that was the big threat. And to make sure that the Russians can't take Japan, and if the Russians do take Japan, then suddenly containment doesn't work anymore, because now instead of being 3.5 to 1.5, it's now 2.5 and 2.5, because you flip one country. And then suddenly, whether or not containment's going to work or not becomes a lot harder to tell. Okay. Anyway, so the U.S. occupation, and I'm not going to talk too long about the U.S. occupation, but aside from saying that in the first phase it's very idealistic and pacifist, and then in the second phase during the reverse course it's more conservative. The point is that when the whole thing is over, the new leaders of Japan basically have this new idea. And the Japanese leaders basically say, okay, we made a mistake. What we did was we put too much effort into our military, and we actually didn't make our people happy. So what we're going to do is we're going to rely on the U.S. to provide a military, to provide a cover for Japan, so that Japan doesn't have to build a big military. And in return, with the money not spent on the military, Japan will be able to then, the Japanese government will then be able to spend that money on making the lives of ordinary people better. So this is going to be the fundamental system that Japan works pretty much to this day. There's still debates over this, but generally speaking, most governments follow this pattern. So you have to sign an alliance with America. With this alliance with America, the U.S.-Japan alliance, with this alliance, the U.S. is going to defend Japan. In return, Japan provides bases for the U.S. The biggest place, the place where it has the most number of bases is Okinawa, but their bases scatter throughout Japan. And here, American troops are residing, and if something happens, then from there they will defend Japan. That's the idea. So U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, that's important. But then that means that you don't have to spend your money on the military. And the unofficial rule, that's not in the Constitution, it's not anywhere, but the unofficial custom is that the GDP, which is the gross domestic product, so it's all the products or all the production of everybody in the country, you will not spend more than 1% of the GDP on the military. This is the new idea, right? So you can actually keep military spending low. And if you keep military spending low, then you can use this money that's available for infrastructure, for education, for healthcare, and various other goodies that Bismarck used to do in the 1880s. Excuse me again. I don't know why you're yawning. So this works. You don't spend too much money on the military, and instead you spend lots of money on the infrastructure of the country and on education. And from 1953 or 52, well, 53 really, all the way until 1973. Well, some people would say 55 to 73. Some people would say 52 to 71. These dates don't really matter, but for almost 2 decades, there is a period called rapid economic growth. The Japanese economy grows by 10% year after year. And if you take away the effects of inflation, it's growing at 8% year after year. 8% growth is really fast. If you grow at 8%, that means your economy is going to double in like 10 years or less, actually more like 9 years. So what happens is the Japanese economy doubles and then it doubles again. So it quadruples from 1950s onwards. And this transforms Japan. It becomes a consumer society that has, that has a very strong middle class. That's, a nice place to live. So people actually like this. So with the rapid economic growth, otherwise known as the income doubling plan, um, the people of Japan are happy. And the party that's representing Japan, the Liberal Democratic Party, that's the dominant party, keeps winning elections. The Liberal Democratic Party, once it's formed in 1955, will continue to win elections all the way until 1993 for 38 straight years. They win free and fair elections every single year. Now, the interesting thing is the LDP also has as one of its platforms ever since 1955 to, change the constitution. The problem is, in order to change the constitution, you need at least 1/3 of the votes in the Japanese parliament. And in Japan, no matter how well the LDP did, the opposition socialists or the opposition communists, like the Japanese left, always won more than 1/3 of the popular vote. They were always more than 1/3 of the seats in parliament were always held, at least 1/3 of the seats were always held by the Japanese left, and they resisted changing the constitution as the LDP, the Liberal Democratic Party, had wanted. So the Liberal Democratic Party is essentially an amalgam of the pre-war parties, the more liberal Minshinto and the more conservative Seiyukai. But when they merged in 1955, the LDP became essentially a centrist political party that doesn't really care about ideology, but really only cares about winning elections. And it's in a capitalist country, the way you win elections is by making sure that the people like the place they live. And it worked. Now, when you do this rapid economic growth like this, and do infrastructure projects like this, one of them being the bullet train, for example, the Japanese economy becomes the second largest economy in the world, but it has costs. And the biggest cost is probably pollution. Pollution was very bad. Things like Kawasaki disease, Minamata disease, and various other, pollution hit Japan. So mercury poisoning is the Minamata disease. Respiratory illness is the Kawasaki disease, and all these things. But because Japan had become democratic, it was democratic before World War II, became fascist. Then after World War II, it goes back to being democratic. Because Japan was democratic, the government would actually hear what the people say, you got to change this, and they would change. And pollution was clamped down starting in the 1970s. And today it's pretty clean once again. All right. Another major problem that happened was a big gap between the rich and the poor. So in Japan, what happened was, depending on the region that you lived in, there became a big gap. So if you recall the areas that I circled on the Meiji Restoration and how there was that belt that became industrialized, well, the people living along that belt became rich. They became wealthy. But the people living outside of that belt, well, it was a lot harder. People living, in the northeast or in the southern part of Kyushu felt like they were being left behind. And it's not necessarily wrong. They were left behind. Their incomes certainly lagged behind what people could make in the cities. And this in turn basically made the cities so popular that people began to leave the cities and go to leave the countryside and go to the cities. And this essentially meant to population decrease. So this had to be resolved. This is not an easy problem to solve in a capitalist system. In 1971, I believe, the Japanese prime minister at the time. Oh, so the Japanese prime minister who talked about the income doubling plan is Ikeda Hayato. The Japanese prime minister who tackled this issue of gap between the rich and the poor in Japan was a fellow named Tanaka Kakue, and his idea was that, okay, we got to just do more education, we got to do more infrastructure spending. Um, Now, ironically, what happens is that in 1973, you have the first oil shock. The price of oil just shoots up, it just quadruples. It just goes up and up and up. It's like crazy. And then in 1979, a second oil shock happens and the price of oil goes up again like crazy. So when this happens, the Japanese industry respond. Because Japan does not produce any oil internally, all the oil Japan uses comes from overseas. They were afraid that if they didn't use the oil, wisely, and if they were gas guzzlers, then they would get screwed because the price of oil is going up, and eventually, if other people start buying the oil from the Middle East, then they might not be able to buy the oil, and that would actually screw you over. So industry all over reacted to this news by raising efficiency. Even if they didn't react to the news, once they saw the price of oil go up, and since everybody uses, not everybody, but a lot of people use cars to go to the offices. A lot of the factories still require coal and oil burning furnaces to turn the turbine to make electricity, etc., etc. So because they knew that oil was really important, and you need oil to run factories too, what they did was they decided to use oil as less as possible, right? So they became a lot more careful in the use of oil and became more efficient because oil is at the heart of all industrial processes these days. So once the Japanese, producers become this really, really, really efficient producer, what happens when the oil shock ends and oil is plentiful again and the price of oil goes low? Well, when they get the oil from overseas at cheap prices, they can, if they used to pay, 10 million, if a factory used to pay $10 million to get the oil, and now the same $10 million gets a lot more oil, well, then the factory can produce a lot more than before. And when that happens, Japan actually needs some place to sell its products. They're making all this stuff, but people inside Japan isn't going to be enough to satisfy the demands of, to satisfy the demand is not going to be enough to satisfy the production. Right. Yeah, the production is so high that it's not going to, it's going to overproduce. But in Japan's case, during the Cold War, America acted as the as the buyer of last resort. So there was a flood of Japanese products to America in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And of course, this led to a backlash. And, the Plaza Accords was ultimately signed so that the flow of Japanese goods to America came, slowed down more. But there you go. Anyway, so let's actually pull this out. I sort of talked about it in detail, but it's actually pretty simple. Japan actually provides a model for other capitalist countries in this manner. Don't spend a lot of money on your military. Spend as little as you can. And when you have that money left over, the government should spend that money on healthcare, on education, on infrastructure development. Healthcare and education is key because if your country doesn't have that much natural resources, then instead of relying on that, you got to rely on the human resources that's available for you. So there you go. Let's stop here because I'm not feeling well still. So here we go. Alrighty, have a good one.